The morning mist clung to the towering pines of the Olympic National Forest like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the Washington wilderness. It was October 15th, 1987, and Park Ranger Christine Valdez had seen enough search and rescue operations to know when something felt fundamentally wrong. The abandoned campsite at Sol Duc had all the hallmarks of a hasty departure. A half-eaten can of beans still sitting on the picnic table, a sleeping bag unzipped and thrown aside, hiking boots placed neatly by the tent, as if their owner had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Christine pulled her ranger jacket tighter around her shoulders as she surveyed the scene for the third time that morning. 23-year-old Marcus Chen had registered for a solo camping permit 3 days earlier, planning a week-long photography expedition to capture the fall colors that transformed the Olympic Peninsula into a painter's palette of gold, crimson, and amber. His girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, had dropped him off at the trailhead with promises to pick him up the following Sunday. When she arrived to find no Marcus and no response to her calls echoing through the forest, she'd immediately contacted the authorities. The campsite told a story that made no sense. Marcus's expensive Nikon camera equipment remained untouched in the tent, thousands of dollars worth of lenses and camera bodies that any opportunistic thief would have snatched without hesitation. His wallet, containing over $200 in cash, sat undisturbed in his backpack. Even his car keys were exactly where they should be, dangling from a carabiner attached to his pack. The tent had been zipped shut from the inside, yet Marcus was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the dense Washington forest, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of unease. Christine had questioned other campers in the area, but the October weather had kept most visitors away. Only an elderly couple, Harold and Marge Henderson from Spokane, had been camping nearby. They were retired teachers on their annual fall foliage tour, methodical people who kept detailed journals of their travels. Harold had noted the time Marcus arrived, 3:47 p.m. on October 12th, and had observed him setting up his camp with the precision of someone experienced in wilderness camping. They reported hearing nothing unusual during the night Marcus disappeared. No calls for help, no sounds of struggle, no indication that anything was amiss in the quiet forest. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now let's continue with Marcus's story. What troubled Christine most was the methodical nature of the abandonment. This wasn't the panicked flight of someone who had encountered a bear or gotten lost in the woods. Everything in the campsite had been left in perfect order, as if Marcus had simply stepped away for a few minutes and planned to return. His sleeping bag was unzipped, but not thrown aside carelessly. It was folded back neatly, as if he had gotten up normally and intended to return. The can of beans on the table wasn't overturned or abandoned mid-meal. It sat upright with a spoon beside it, as if he had simply paused while eating. Christine walked the perimeter of the campsite again, her trained eyes searching for any detail that might have been missed during the initial search. The ground around the tent showed Marcus's footprints clearly, size 10 hiking boots with a distinctive tread pattern that made them easy to track, but the tracks simply ended at the edge of the campsite. There was no trail leading into the forest, no indication of which direction he might have gone. It was as if he had walked to the edge of his camp and then vanished into thin air. The search team had arrived within hours of Sarah's call, bringing dogs, helicopters, and experienced trackers familiar with the Olympic National Forest's challenging terrain. They had combed through miles of wilderness, following game trails, checking stream beds, and investigating every possible route Marcus might have taken. The search dogs had picked up his scent at the campsite, but lost it completely just beyond the camping area, as if the trail had been deliberately obscured. or simply cease to exist. As the search entered its third day, Christine found herself studying Marcus's hiking plans more carefully. He had submitted a detailed itinerary with his permit application, marking specific locations where he intended to photograph the changing foliage. Most were well-known spots along established trails: Hurricane Ridge, the Ho River Valley, Lake Crescent. But one location caught her attention and sent a chill down her spine. It was a remote area near the Bogachil River that wasn't on any official park map. Marcus had drawn it in by hand, marking it with a small star and the notation "Old-growth giants, perfect light at dawn." The hand-drawn location was precise, complete with GPS coordinates that Marcus had apparently researched extensively. Christine pulled out her topographical maps and located the area he had marked. It was deep in the wilderness, accessible only by unmarked trails and requiring a challenging hike through difficult terrain. But what made her blood run cold was the realization that she had seen those exact coordinates before, in incident reports that had been filed away and largely forgotten. Christine spent the remainder of that day in the basement archives of the ranger station, pulling files that hadn't been touched in years. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. The area Marcus had marked corresponded exactly with a spot that had been the site of 3 other disappearances over the past 25 years. In 1962, a geology student named Danny Morrison had vanished while conducting research in the area. In 1978, an amateur ornithologist named Robert Hayes had disappeared while tracking a rare bird species. Each disappearance shared identical characteristics: no signs of struggle, personal belongings left behind, and no trace of where the person had gone. But it was the oldest file that revealed the most chilling detail. In 1943, during the height of World War II, a logging operation in that exact location had been mysteriously abandoned overnight. All 27 workers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind their equipment, their personal belongings, and no explanation for their disappearance. The logging company, Cascade Timber Corporation, had reported the incident to local authorities, but with the war consuming the nation's attention and resources, the investigation had been cursory at best. The official report simply stated that the workers had abandoned their posts, and the case was closed without further investigation. The disappearances weren't random. They followed a precise timeline that made Christine's hands shake as she plotted them on a calendar. Every 15 to 16 years, always in October, always involving solo hikers or researchers who had specifically sought out the remote area near the Bogachil River. The precision was too exact to be coincidental, too methodical to be the work of wild animals or random violence. Someone or some group had been operating in that area for over 40 years, systematically eliminating individuals who got too close to whatever they were hiding. Christine's investigation took on a new urgency as she realized the implications of what she had discovered. Marcus Chen hadn't randomly wandered into danger. He had been specifically drawn to a location that served as a trap, luring individuals who possessed certain characteristics or knowledge that made them threats to someone's carefully guarded secret. But what kind of secret could be worth protecting for over 4 decades, and who had the resources and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up? The breakthrough came when Christine decided to examine the backgrounds of the previous victims more carefully. Danny Morrison, the geology student who had disappeared in 1962, hadn't been conducting routine research. His academic advisor described him as brilliant and methodical, working on a classified project for the U.S. Geological Survey that involved identifying mineral deposits that could be strategically important during the Cold War. His disappearance had occurred just days before he was scheduled to submit a report that could have influenced national mining policy. Robert Hayes, the bird watcher who vanished in 1978, had been more than just an amateur ornithologist. Christine discovered that he was a retired military intelligence officer who had served in Vietnam and maintained security clearances that allowed him access to classified environmental data. His bird-watching expeditions were often covers for intelligence-gathering operations, and his final journal entries suggested he had discovered evidence of activities in the forest that weren't supposed to exist. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified Christine more than she wanted to admit. The victims weren't random hikers who had gotten lost in the woods. They were individuals with specialized knowledge or security clearances who had stumbled upon something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. Marcus Chen, with his background in investigative photography and his connections to environmental advocacy groups, fit the profile perfectly. Christine realized she was dealing with something far more sinister than random disappearances or even serial killings. This was a systematic elimination program designed to protect a secret that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate power. The remote location near the Bogachil River wasn't just a killing ground. It was the site of activities so sensitive that witnesses had to be permanently silenced to protect national security interests. Her investigation had attracted attention from quarters she hadn't expected. Strange vehicles began appearing near her home, black sedans with tinted windows that seemed to watch her movements. Her phone calls developed odd echoes and background noises that suggested surveillance equipment. Most disturbing of all, she discovered that her personnel file had been accessed by someone outside the Park Service, someone with high-level government clearances that allowed them to review classified information about federal employees. Christine knew she was running out of time. Whatever Marcus had discovered, whatever had motivated someone to orchestrate his disappearance, she needed to find concrete evidence before she became the next victim. The realization that she was being watched only strengthened her resolve. If she disappeared now, the truth would die with her, and Marcus's fate would remain forever unknown. The decision to venture into the remote area herself was both desperate and calculated. Christine couldn't rely on official channels. Her investigation had already attracted too much unwanted attention from people with the power to make her disappear as easily as they had eliminated Marcus and the others. But she also couldn't abandon the search without knowing what had really happened to the young photographer who had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Christine spent days preparing for what she knew might be her final investigation. She made copies of all her research and mailed them to journalists, environmental lawyers, and government watchdog organizations she trusted. If she didn't return, at least someone would know what she had discovered and might be able to continue the investigation. She also wrote detailed letters to her family, explaining her findings and asking them to pursue justice if anything happened to her. Armed with survival gear, communication equipment, and her service weapon, Christine set out for the remote area near the Bogachil River on a grey October morning that reminded her uncomfortably of the day Marcus had disappeared. The journey would take her through some of the most challenging terrain in the Olympic National Forest, following unmarked trails through dense undergrowth and across treacherous streams swollen by autumn rains. As she hiked deeper into the wilderness, Christine couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if the wildlife sensed danger and had fled to safer areas. Even the birds were silent, creating an eerie atmosphere that made every sound seem amplified and threatening. She checked her communication equipment regularly, but the deeper she went into the forest, the weaker the signals became, until she was effectively cut off from the outside world. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as she approached the area Marcus had marked on his map. Ancient Douglas firs towered overhead, their massive trunks blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight at ground level. The underbrush was thick with ferns and moss that soaked her boots and made progress slow and exhausting. But it wasn't just the natural obstacles that made Christine nervous. It was the growing evidence that this remote area wasn't as untouched by human activity as it appeared. She found Marcus's first trail marker after 3 hours of difficult hiking, a small pile of stones arranged in an arrow pattern pointing deeper into the forest. It was exactly the kind of navigation aid Marcus had mentioned in his permit application, a technique he used to mark his path through unmarked terrain. The sight of the stone arrow sent a chill through Christine's body, confirming that Marcus had indeed reached this remote location and had been methodical about documenting his route. The trail markers led Christine through increasingly dense forest, each stone arrow pointing her further from any established trail or recognizable landmark. But as she followed Marcus's path, she began to notice other signs of human presence. Subtle marks on trees that looked like surveillance positions, areas where the undergrowth had been carefully cleared to create sightlines, and most disturbing of all, the barely visible remains of what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system. Christine's training kicked in as she recognized the signs of a professional surveillance operation. Hidden cameras disguised as natural features, motion sensors camouflaged among the trees, and communication equipment that could monitor activities throughout the remote area. This wasn't the work of casual hunters or even environmental activists. It was a military-grade surveillance network that had been carefully installed and maintained over many years. The fourth trail marker was different from the others, and when Christine found it, she knew she had reached the heart of the mystery. Instead of pointing forward, the stones formed a perfect circle, and in the center lay Marcus's camera, not damaged or discarded, but carefully placed as if it had been left as evidence or a warning. Christine approached the camera with extreme caution, her hand resting on her service weapon as she scanned the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The camera was a professional-grade Nikon, exactly the type Marcus was known to use for his investigative photography work. When Christine examined it, she discovered that the film had been partially exposed to light, destroying most of the images, but the damage appeared to be deliberate rather than accidental. Someone had opened the camera in bright light, knowing it would ruin the film, but had been careful to preserve just enough to send a message. As Christine studied the ruined camera, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors approaching through the forest canopy. She had been found. The same network that had eliminated Marcus, Danny Morrison, Robert Hayes, and countless others over the decades was now closing in on her. But Christine had prepared for this possibility, and she had one advantage her predecessors hadn't possessed. She had already distributed evidence of her findings to people who would ask questions if she disappeared. The helicopters grew louder, and Christine realized she had only minutes before they arrived at her location. She made a desperate decision, grabbing Marcus's camera and as many of the stone markers as she could carry, then plunging deeper into the forest in search of cover. If she could evade capture long enough to examine the camera more carefully, she might be able to understand what Marcus had photographed that had cost him his life. Christine found temporary shelter in a dense grove of old-growth cedars, their massive trunks providing cover from aerial surveillance. Working quickly in the dim light, she examined Marcus's camera more carefully and made a discovery that explained everything. Hidden in the camera's memory buffer was a single digital image that had survived the film destruction, an aerial photograph that revealed the truth behind 40 years of disappearances and cover-ups. The image showed a massive clear-cut area hidden deep in the national forest, completely invisible from ground level but obvious from above. But this wasn't just illegal logging. The photograph revealed a sophisticated industrial operation that included processing facilities, storage buildings, and what appeared to be a private airstrip capable of handling large aircraft. Most disturbing of all, the image showed barrels and containers labeled with hazardous waste symbols, indicating that the site was being used for illegal toxic waste disposal on a massive scale. Christine understood now why people had been disappearing for decades. This wasn't just about protecting illegal logging operations. It was about concealing environmental crimes that would result in billions of dollars in cleanup costs and criminal charges that could destroy entire corporations and imprison government officials who had participated in the cover-up. The remote forest location was the perfect hiding place for activities that would trigger international outrage if they became public knowledge. The sound of helicopters was now directly overhead, and Christine could hear voices calling through the forest canopy. Professional search teams were converging on her location with military precision, using equipment and tactics that confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. These weren't just corporate security guards or local law enforcement. They were specialists trained to eliminate threats to national security interests. As the search teams closed in, Christine made a final, desperate gamble. Using her emergency communication equipment, she transmitted Marcus's photograph and her research findings to every contact she could reach, hoping that at least some of the information would get through before she was captured. The transmission was brief and probably incomplete, but it was her only chance to ensure that the truth about Marcus's disappearance would eventually come to light. The confrontation that followed would determine whether the decades-long cover-up would continue or whether the victims of the Olympic National Forest conspiracy would finally receive justice. Christine Valdez had uncovered evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power, but her survival now depended on proving that the truth was already beyond their ability to contain. The men who emerged from the helicopters weren't wearing uniforms, but their bearing and equipment marked them as professionals accustomed to operating outside normal legal constraints. Their leader approached Christine with the confidence of someone who had handled similar situations many times before, his cold eyes assessing her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reasoned with. "Ranger Valdez," he said, his voice carrying no emotion beyond professional courtesy. "You've uncovered information that affects national security interests. We need to discuss how to resolve this situation in a way that protects everyone involved." The words were polite, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. Christine realized she was facing people who had the authority and resources to make her disappear as completely as they had eliminated Marcus and all the others. But Christine had one crucial advantage that her predecessors had lacked. Her investigation and its findings had already been distributed to multiple sources outside the immediate reach of the conspiracy. Even if she didn't survive the encounter, the evidence would continue to exist, waiting for someone brave enough to pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost. The negotiation that followed in the dim forest light would determine not just Christine's fate, but whether the decades of cover-up and murder would finally be exposed to public scrutiny. The stakes couldn't be higher. Billions of dollars in environmental cleanup costs, criminal charges that could reach the highest levels of government, and international repercussions that could damage America's reputation for generations. Marcus Chen's disappearance had been the latest in a long line of systematic eliminations designed to protect secrets that powerful people considered more important than human lives. But his final photograph, preserved against all odds in his camera's memory, might finally provide the evidence needed to bring justice to all the victims of the Olympic National Forest conspiracy. The truth about what had happened in that remote wilderness was about to be revealed, But the cost of that revelation would be measured in lives destroyed, careers ended, and institutions shattered by exposure to the light of public scrutiny. Christine Valdez stood at the center of a storm that had been building for over 40 years, and her decisions in the next few minutes would determine whether the victims would finally receive justice or whether the cover-up would claim yet another life. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation reached its climax, the ancient trees bearing silent witness to secrets that had been buried beneath their roots for decades. What happened next would either end the conspiracy or ensure its continuation for another generation, adding Christine's name to the list of people who had discovered too much and paid the ultimate price for their curiosity. The investigation into Marcus Chen's disappearance had reached its most dangerous phase, with Park Ranger Christine Valdez facing the same people who had orchestrated decades of systematic eliminations to protect secrets hidden deep in the Olympic National Forest. The evidence she had uncovered revealed not just the fate of a missing photographer, but a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power. The leader of the professional team that had cornered Christine in the remote forest made his position clear with chilling directness. "The activities you've discovered in this area are classified at the highest levels of national security," he explained, his voice devoid of any emotion that might suggest sympathy or negotiation. "The Cascade timber operations here aren't just about lumber or waste disposal. They're cover for programs that have been protecting American strategic interests for over 40 years. Christine felt her world shift as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The illegal logging and toxic waste disposal she had uncovered were just the surface layers of something far more complex and dangerous. The remote forest location wasn't just being used for corporate environmental crimes, it was the site of classified government operations that officially didn't exist, protected by a network of elimination and cover-up that had been claiming lives for decades. Marcus Chen wasn't just investigating illegal logging, the man continued, pulling out a thick file that contained more information about the young photographer than should have been possible to gather. He was a freelance journalist, with connections to environmental groups that have been designated as potential security threats. His investigation was targeting not just Cascade timber, but government programs that are vital to national defense. The file revealed details about Marcus's life that painted him as much more than a nature photographer seeking to capture autumn foliage. He had worked as an investigative journalist for several environmental magazines, specializing in exposing corporate pollution and government cover-ups of environmental crimes. His camera equipment was sophisticated enough to document evidence that could be used in federal court cases, and his contacts included lawyers, scientists, and activists who had the knowledge and resources to turn his photographs into legal weapons. But it was Marcus's most recent project that had made him a target for elimination. According to the file, he had been working on a comprehensive investigation of illegal waste disposal on federal lands, tracing a network of corporations and government agencies that had been using remote wilderness areas as dumping grounds for toxic materials that were too dangerous or controversial to dispose of through legal channels. Christine realized that Marcus's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who got too close to exposing activities that would trigger international outrage if they became public. The remote area near the Bogachiel River was just one of many locations where similar operations were taking place, protected by the same network of surveillance, intimidation, and murder that had been claiming victims for decades. The programs conducted here have prevented terrorist attacks, stopped foreign espionage operations, and developed technologies that have saved thousands of American lives, the team leader continued, his justification delivered with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed in the righteousness of his cause. The unfortunate deaths of individuals like Marcus Chen are the price of protecting millions of other Americans from threats they never even know existed. The moral calculus being presented to Christine was both simple and horrifying. Accept that some people had to die in secret to protect the greater good, or join the list of those whose deaths served that same purpose. But Christine had seen enough of the evidence to understand that the greater good, being protected, involved massive environmental crimes, illegal human experimentation, and violations of constitutional rights that went far beyond any legitimate national security concerns. The negotiation that followed revealed layers of the conspiracy that Christine hadn't even suspected. The government facility hidden beneath the forest cover had been established during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project, but instead of being shut down after the war ended, it had been expanded and repurposed for increasingly controversial research programs that couldn't be conducted at any official government installation. Over the decades, the facility had become a testing ground for chemical weapons, biological warfare agents, and environmental modification techniques that violated international treaties the United States had signed. The toxic waste disposal operations were just a cover for research activities that would trigger war crimes investigations if they were exposed to international scrutiny. Cascade Timber Corporation had been recruited as the perfect front organization, providing legitimate business activity to explain the presence of workers, equipment, and supplies in the remote forest location. The company's executives received lucrative government contracts and regulatory exemptions in exchange for their cooperation and silence. Anyone who threatened to expose the operation was eliminated through methods designed to appear as random disappearances or accidents. Christine learned that the surveillance network she had discovered was just one part of a comprehensive security system that monitored activities throughout the Olympic National Forest and several other wilderness areas where similar operations were taking place. Satellite imagery, electronic communications intercepts, and human intelligence networks tracked potential threats and identified individuals who posed risks to the classified programs. Marcus Chen had been under surveillance for months before his final camping trip, his communications monitored and his movements tracked as he gathered evidence for his environmental investigation. The decision to eliminate him had been made when his research got too close to the truth, and his camping trip to the Olympic National Forest had provided the perfect opportunity to make him disappear without attracting unwanted attention. But the conspiracy had made a critical mistake in their handling of Marcus's elimination. Unlike previous victims who had been isolated researchers or activists with limited connections, Marcus had been part of a network of journalists and environmental lawyers who would ask questions if he disappeared. His girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, wasn't just a concerned partner. She was also an environmental science graduate student who understood the significance of Marcus's research and had contacts who could continue his investigation. Christine realized that her own investigation had been anticipated and manipulated from the beginning. The evidence she had discovered in the Park Service archives hadn't been left there by accident. It had been carefully placed to lead her to specific conclusions while keeping her away from the most sensitive information. Even her discovery of Marcus's camera had been orchestrated to provide her with just enough evidence to understand the stakes while demonstrating the futility of opposing the conspiracy. The team leader made the final terms of Christine's situation brutally clear. "You have two choices, Ranger Valdez. You can accept a transfer to a different park system, along with appropriate financial compensation for your cooperation and silence. Or you can join Marcus Chen and the others, who chose to pursue information that was too dangerous for them to possess. But Christine had prepared for this moment, and she had one advantage that her captors didn't know about. Before leaving for her final investigation, she had not only distributed copies of her research to journalists and lawyers, but had also arranged for automatic transmission of additional evidence if she failed to check in at predetermined times. The conspiracy might be able to eliminate her, but they couldn't stop the information from reaching people who would ask uncomfortable questions. The standoff in the forest continued for hours, with both sides calculating their options and the potential consequences of their decisions. Christine's captors couldn't simply eliminate her without risking exposure of the entire operation, especially since her investigation had already attracted attention from outside parties. But Christine knew that her survival depended on proving she could be more valuable alive than dead. The breakthrough came when Christine revealed the extent of her preparations and the automatic triggers she had established to release information if she disappeared. The conspiracy leaders realized they were facing a situation they had never encountered before. A victim who had anticipated their response and prepared countermeasures that would expose their activities regardless of what happened to her. The negotiation that followed established a new paradigm for the decades-old conspiracy. Instead of eliminating Christine, they would allow her to live with a new identity and constant surveillance, while gradually shutting down the most vulnerable aspects of their operations. The illegal logging and waste disposal activities would be ended, but the classified research programs would be moved to other locations, where they could continue without the risk of exposure. Christine understood that she was accepting a devil's bargain, her life in exchange for allowing the conspiracy to continue its activities in different locations. But she also knew that the evidence she had already distributed would eventually lead to broader investigations that might expose the full scope of the government's illegal activities, even if it took years or decades for the truth to fully emerge. The cover-up of Christine's discovery was as sophisticated as everything else about the conspiracy. Official records showed that she had died in a helicopter crash while conducting search and rescue operations in the Olympic National Forest, her body lost in a remote area that was too dangerous to search thoroughly. The story was believable and consistent with the hazardous nature of her work, attracting no unwanted attention from investigators or journalists. But the evidence Christine had distributed before her death began to surface gradually through the work of the journalists and environmental lawyers who had received her research. Freedom of Information Act requests, environmental lawsuits, and congressional inquiries slowly began to chip away at the conspiracy's protective barriers, forcing them to abandon some of their most vulnerable operations, while maintaining others under even deeper cover. Marcus Chen's case remained officially unsolved, but his final photographs eventually reached environmental groups and investigative journalists who understood their significance. The evidence he had died to obtain became part of a larger pattern of documentation that revealed the scope of illegal activities taking place on federal lands throughout the American West. The woman who had once been Christine Valdez watched these developments from her new life in a small Montana town, living under a name she had never chosen and constantly aware that her survival depended on her continued silence about what she had discovered. She had traded her identity and freedom for the knowledge that Marcus's sacrifice would eventually contribute to exposing the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. Years passed, and the evidence continued to accumulate. Environmental groups filed lawsuits challenging illegal activities on federal lands. Investigative journalists published exposés of government cover-ups and corporate environmental crimes. Congressional committees held hearings about classified programs that seemed to violate constitutional protections and international treaties. The conspiracy adapted to these challenges by moving their operations to even more remote locations and developing new methods of eliminating threats before they could gather enough evidence to cause serious damage. But they could never completely eliminate the risk that someone like Marcus Chen or Christine Valdez would stumble upon their activities and prove brave enough to pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost. The Olympic National Forest eventually returned to its natural state, with the illegal logging operations shut down and the toxic waste sites cleaned up through a complex legal settlement that avoided admitting government wrongdoing. The area where Marcus had disappeared became part of an expanded wilderness protection zone, ensuring that future visitors would never know about the deadly secrets that had once been buried beneath the towering trees. But somewhere in the files of environmental organizations and investigative journalists, the evidence gathered by Marcus Chen and Christine Valdez continued to exist, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it fully into the light. The truth about the Olympic National Forest conspiracy remained incomplete, but the foundation had been laid for future investigators who might be able to complete the work that had cost so many lives. The case of Marcus Chen would remain officially unsolved, but his legacy lived on in the environmental protections his photographs had helped to establish and the ongoing investigations his sacrifice had made possible. The truth was out there, documented and preserved, waiting for someone with the courage and resources to ensure that the victims of government conspiracy would finally receive the justice they deserved. In the end, the conspiracy had survived, but it had been wounded and forced to retreat from some of its most egregious activities. The price of protecting their secrets had become higher, and the risk of exposure had increased to levels that made some of their operations unsustainable. Marcus Chen's disappearance had been intended to silence an inconvenient truth, but instead it had created a legacy of evidence that would continue to threaten the conspiracy for years to come. The aftermath of the Olympic National Forest conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate fate of Marcus Chen and Christine Valdez, creating ripple effects that would influence environmental policy, government oversight, and investigative journalism for decades to come. The evidence they had gathered, distributed through networks of lawyers, journalists, and activists, became the foundation for a broader understanding of how government agencies and corporations had been systematically violating environmental laws and constitutional rights under the cover of national security. Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's girlfriend, refused to accept the official explanation of his disappearance and became a driving force behind continued investigation into his case. Her background in environmental science gave her the technical knowledge to understand the significance of the evidence Marcus had been gathering, and her personal motivation provided the emotional fuel to pursue the truth, despite mounting pressure from government agencies and corporate lawyers who wanted the case to disappear. Working with environmental law firms that had received copies of Christine's research, Sarah filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests that gradually revealed the existence of classified programs operating on federal lands throughout the American West. The government's attempts to claim national security exemptions for these programs only attracted more attention from investigative journalists and congressional oversight committees who began asking uncomfortable questions about activities that seemed to violate both environmental laws and constitutional protections. The Cascade Timber Corporation found itself at the center of a legal storm that threatened to expose decades of illegal activities conducted under government protection. Environmental groups filed lawsuits challenging the company's logging operations on federal land, using Marcus's photographs and Christine's research as evidence of systematic violations of environmental regulations. The company's executives, faced with potential criminal charges and billions of dollars in cleanup costs, began cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the anthropologist who had assisted Christine's investigation, became a key figure in exposing the historical scope of the conspiracy. Her research into indigenous oral histories provided crucial context for understanding how long illegal activities had been taking place in the Olympic National Forest, and her academic credentials gave legitimacy to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as conspiracy theories. The breakthrough in the case came when Dr. Reeves discovered archived documents from the 1940s that revealed the true purpose of the original logging camp that had been mysteriously abandoned in 1943. The documents, found in the University of Washington Special Collections, showed that the logging operation had been a cover for Manhattan Project research activities that were considered too dangerous to conduct at official government facilities. The historical documents revealed that the remote forest location had been chosen specifically because it provided complete isolation from populated areas, allowing researchers to conduct experiments with radioactive materials and chemical weapons that would have been impossible at more conventional facilities. The sudden abandonment of the camp in 1943 hadn't been mysterious at all. It had been the result of a containment breach that killed all the workers and required immediate evacuation of the area. But instead of properly cleaning up the contaminated site, government officials had simply classified the entire incident and left the toxic materials buried in the forest, where they continued to pose environmental and health hazards for decades. The subsequent disappearances of individuals who got too close to the site weren't the result of an ongoing conspiracy to eliminate witnesses. They were the result of exposure to deadly chemicals and radioactive materials that had been leaking into the environment for over 40 years. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation and the legal strategies being pursued by environmental groups and victims' families. Instead of trying to prove that a vast conspiracy had been systematically murdering people to protect government secrets, they could focus on documenting environmental crimes and seeking compensation for the victims of government negligence and cover-up. Marcus Chen's final photographs took on new significance as evidence of ongoing environmental contamination rather than proof of current illegal activities. The toxic waste barrels he had documented weren't part of an active disposal operation. They were the remnants of World War II-era experiments that had been abandoned and forgotten by subsequent generations of government officials who lacked the security clearances to know what had been buried in the forest. The legal settlement that eventually resolved the Olympic National Forest case established important precedents for environmental litigation and government accountability. The federal government agreed to fund a comprehensive cleanup of contaminated sites throughout the forest, while admitting no wrongdoing beyond administrative oversights in maintaining adequate records of historical activities. Cascade Timber Corporation paid substantial damages to environmental groups and victims' families, while agreeing to permanent restrictions on their logging operations in environmentally sensitive areas. The company's executives avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with investigators and providing detailed testimony about the government contracts that had led them to participate in the cover-up. The families of Marcus Chen and the other victims received financial compensation, but more importantly, they gained access to the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Marcus hadn't been murdered by government agents to protect ongoing conspiracies. He had been the victim of environmental contamination that resulted from decades of government negligence and secrecy. Christine Valdez eventually emerged from her forced anonymity when the legal settlement provided protection for whistleblowers who had exposed government wrongdoing. Her testimony before congressional committees revealed the extent of surveillance and intimidation tactics that had been used to protect the cover-up, leading to reforms in how government agencies handle environmental contamination on federal lands. The Olympic National Forest case became a catalyst for broader investigations into government activities on public lands throughout the American West. Environmental groups and investigative journalists used the legal precedents established in the Marcus Chen case to challenge other classified programs that seemed to violate environmental laws and constitutional rights. The lessons learned from the Olympic National Forest conspiracy influenced environmental policy for generations, establishing stricter oversight of government activities on public lands and creating legal protections for whistleblowers who expose environmental crimes. Marcus Chen's sacrifice had contributed to a broader understanding of how government secrecy and corporate complicity could combine to create environmental disasters that threatened public health and safety. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the recognition that environmental crimes and government cover-ups could continue for decades unless ordinary citizens like Marcus Chen and Christine Valdez were willing to risk their lives to expose the truth. Their courage had prevented the contamination from spreading to other areas and had forced the government to finally address environmental hazards that had been threatening public health for over 40 years. The Olympic National Forest eventually recovered from the environmental damage caused by decades of government negligence and corporate irresponsibility. The cleanup efforts revealed the full extent of the contamination and allowed for proper remediation of sites that had been poisoning the ecosystem for generations. The forest became a symbol of environmental recovery and a testament to the importance of government accountability and corporate responsibility. Today, visitors to the Olympic National Forest can hike through areas that were once contaminated with deadly chemicals and radioactive materials, unaware of the environmental disaster that was hidden beneath the towering trees for so many years. The wilderness has reclaimed the sites where government experiments once threatened the health of anyone who ventured too close, and wildlife populations have recovered from decades of exposure to toxic materials. The case of Marcus Chen remains a reminder of the price that individuals sometimes pay for pursuing environmental truth in the face of government secrecy and corporate power. His disappearance led to discoveries that protected countless future visitors to the Olympic National Forest, while his photographs provided crucial evidence for environmental remediation efforts that restored the wilderness to its natural state. The truth about what happened in the Olympic National Forest took years to fully emerge, but when it did, it revealed both the worst and best aspects of American society. The willingness of government agencies and corporations to sacrifice public health for perceived security benefits, and the courage of individuals who risk everything to expose environmental crimes and protect future generations from the consequences of official negligence and secrecy. Marcus Chen's story became part of a larger narrative about environmental justice and government accountability, inspiring future generations of environmental activists and investigative journalists to continue the work of exposing environmental crimes and demanding government transparency. His legacy lives on in the legal protections and environmental policies that were established as a result of his sacrifice, ensuring that future Marcus Chens will have better legal protections and institutional support when they choose to challenge powerful interests that threaten public health and environmental safety.